welcome Adam Bennett, CEO of the New South Wales Land Registry Services. Great to have you. Thank you.
Oh, it's good to be here, Rocky. Good to see you again.
Thank you. Now, Adam, we've known each other a long time, and I've had the pleasure of seeing you work through transformations of all different sizes and scale. And so what would be your recommendations, your advice to those executives who are at the very beginning of embarking upon a transformation?
Well, great question, Rocky. Thank you. Probably the first thing I would agree on is let's define transformation, because it's one of those terms that all of us may have a different view of what exactly is it we're talking about. And so if we're going to be focused on it, we should all have a similar meaning. And I think transformation really is reliant on three key elements. One, disruption. So there is some disruptive forces happening in your world, your industry, may even be your company, that you need to be sensitive to and aware of. So that's the first point. Number two, having observed those, you then have to craft a strategy to address them. And that strategy has to be cogent, it has to make sense, again, for your company, for your industry. And thirdly, you have to take action. You have to implement something. You have to execute on a plan to bring that strategy to life. So they're the three elements I think it's really important to get agreed right up front. That's how I would define transformation.
So how do you line up the culture behind the strategy? I mean, you've worked in organisations and done transformations where it involved large amounts of people. And so how have you approached that?
Yeah, I think my approach is always, again, and it may be a little bit formulaic, but it seems to work. One is to be very clear on what you're trying to achieve. And I think coming back to those three elements, so grounding the need to change. People have to understand why is it we're embarking on some kind of transformation. Secondly, they need to understand what is it you're trying to achieve and clarity around those objectives, and being able to put out there some metrics or some kind of stake in the ground as to what you're trying to achieve. And then I think it's important to reflect on two things that are unique in terms of your own context. And number one of those is mindset, and number two is mechanics.
Yes.
And what do I mean by mindset? So all organisations have a way of doing things, what we sometimes refer to as culture. That could be the mindset of the people in that organisation. Then there could be people who are very attuned to change. They're watching carefully what happens in the outside world. They're very excited and energised by change. They're continually seeking to kind of take their company forward. Equally, we can't ignore the fact that in organisations there are the opposite to that too, where you have people who love to defend their turf, or they're very conservative or traditionalist. They don't really believe that things should change. Or you have people who will lose from the transformation and will therefore dig in and try and preserve the status quo and preserve their own kind of role, etc. And you also have people who are disengaged, frankly, who are not really going to put their shoulder to the wheel of anything, let alone putting their shoulder to the wheel of a transformation. So understanding all of those different mindsets and then working out, well, how do you actually navigate those? Because some of those people, they might be rationalists. They'll just do what's in their scorecard. Yeah. So back to the mechanics now, by then changing their scorecards, you will give them a new set of targets, new set of objectives, and the rationalists will start to go in those directions.
Yes.
You do, mechanically, you also have to deal with those who are potentially obstructionists to the transformation. And that is a kind of seldom discussed and sometimes uncomfortable truth, that not everyone is going to benefit from the transformation. And Machiavelli back in 1532 put it pretty well when he said, and one should bear in mind that there is nothing more dubious of success, dangerous to administer, than to introduce a new way of doing things.
Wow.
For you have enemies in all those who profit from the existing way of doing things, and only lukewarm allies in all who may profit from the new. Yes. So he's pretty right.
Yes.
You do come across people who they don't want to transform.
Yes.
So you have to deal to that, and that might be, unfortunately, those people have to exit the organisation.
Yeah.
And that then, how do you do that? Back to your premise of your question around culturally, without damaging the culture of the organisation. So you have to be transparent, you have to be fair, but you have to be determined that this transformation is more about the organisation and its goals and objectives and kind of wide set of stakeholders is more important than one or two individual executives.
Yeah.
And then for the rest of the organisation, understanding their views. They've got legitimate views, and how do you get the best of that on the table?
Yeah.
It's been my experience, whenever I've come into organisations, there is always many, many people who have a view of how the organisation could be better.
Yeah.
And how do you unlock that?
Yes.
And I think a very easy question as you come into any kind of role or you push into any kind of transformation is to just simply ask the question, what should I do more of? What should I stop? What do you hope I do?
Yeah.
And I've always found that the answers you get to that question are incredible and are usually very insightful because people know the organisation, they know the company, they know the industry.
And do you think during COVID that really forced a lot of organisations to rethink, their perceptions of how agile they may or may not have been? I mean, it was fascinating to watch some organisations who their peers really struggled to adapt and change. And I've often wondered whether that was a function of the fact that they've attenuated resilience out of the organisation or swung the pendulum too far in terms of pursuing productivity and efficiency at the expense of resilience. And so those organisations that were perhaps a lot more agile seem to have adapted quite well to all of the pressures that occurred during COVID.
Yeah, I think COVID's been an interesting time. I mean, and I'd characterise the impact of COVID on many organisations, certainly on ours. I mean, our organisation had no legacy of working from home.
Yeah.
It was previously a government department and was not set up for working from home. And by that, it doesn't have the tools, didn't have the processes, nor culture of working from home. So people had desktop computers, for example. At the start of COVID, we very quickly saw what was coming. So we were in the market and we went out and bought a couple of hundred laptops. So we were able to very quickly get our people out of the office. Now that's geography. We had to adjust some of our processes and those types of things. And I think many organisations have been the same. And I think COVID has accelerated a digital transition, and many industries I think are seeing that. I mean, if I look at banking, for example, if I just look at the number of bank branches within a couple hundred metres of this office, and they've all closed. So obviously one of the major banks' response has been to accelerate the momentum towards digital channels and direct channels. You've seen that play out where people just haven't been able to go into a branch. And so they've obviously taken advantage of that to give a better customer experience. And I think many industries, whether that's retail, financial services, the momentum towards digital has accelerated. And I think COVID probably brought that forward a number of years far faster than it would have been potentially without COVID.
So with that momentum of change and thinking about the decade ahead, what are the kinds of emerging technologies that you've got your eye on that you think are going to bring in the next wave of major disruption or transformation?
Yeah, there are a couple of technologies, I think, and this is where I think you also have to be careful lest you be, I think it was Watson, the chairman or CEO of early IBM, who said, I think there's a market internationally for about 2 or 3 computers. You probably know the quote. He got that wrong by a couple. So I think we've got to be careful about which specific technologies, but I think the way I would characterise technological change is absolutely we have not yet reached peak change. So I think the pace of change is accelerating. I don't think it's slowing down, and I think the impact of that is yet to play out in ways that we can't really fathom yet. If I just take one of those, say artificial intelligence, I think that's one that has massive potential to really impact a lot of different roles. And if I use 2 examples, one is there's a great example in a book by Andrew Yang, which is called The War on Ordinary People. And he talks about the impact of full self-driving on truck drivers in the US. And that's a good example where he says, look, there's about 2.5 million truck drivers. They're predominantly male, and they're served by about 6 or 7 million service station, motel accommodation, truck stop type market, both of which will be impacted by full self-driving, for example, where there's a fleet of full self-driving trucks, those jobs just disappear. Now, those jobs, the people doing those jobs will have to obviously find something else, and that won't necessarily be easy for those people. At the other end of the spectrum, you have a whole heap of the more cerebral roles, whether that's medicine, legal, kind of business roles, etc., where those jobs, again, are being either complemented or replaced by artificial intelligence. And we've seen IBM, for example, at least 5, 6, 7 years ago, was into the diagnosis of melanoma, for example, using their Watson supercomputer. And that was far better at diagnosing melanomas than a human doctor. And with the rate of change of science and experimentation and the literature, etc., if you take medicine, I think the going rate at the moment for a medical practitioner to stay current with the current literature, they'd have to study about a month every year to just keep up. Whereas AI and learning and machine learning is just able to digest all of that knowledge almost instantaneously and then be able to complement those roles. So I think that's going to play out. And I think a lot of people may well be surprised at what they perceived as being a very secure profession, let alone a job, are going to come under intense kind of threat from either machine learning or artificial intelligence as full replacement or augmenting their roles. And this is where you see companies like Upstart in the US looking at credit, credit assessment to replace FICO. That will completely change how banks assess credit. Personal loans, mortgages, etc. Companies like UiPath, which is making almost like personalised robotics for office workers to self-use and design parts out of their job for this software to then do that routine, easy stuff to free them up to do other things. So we're going to see the whole gamut of AI playing out, and I think it's going to be fascinating.
Look, it's amazing when the question of how have labour markets adapted in each industrial revolution has unfolded. And I looked at the US labour market data going back to the 1850s. And so back then, where most of the population was distributed around agrarian agriculture, and then with the advent of locomotion and steam power, we saw, countries being colonised. But you also saw the emergence of new industries. You saw, wholesale trade, retail trade. You saw professional services emerge. And so what's fascinating, I think, is that we shouldn't be questioning humans' capacity to adapt. I mean, that's why we're here. But it's the speed of change, which I think is what lay ahead in the oncoming decade. And these technologies, such as artificial intelligence, are really accelerating the pace of change. And so that sort of comes into a really interesting question around, what you think the critical success factors for organisations this coming decade might be. In the past, I guess we could look to brand, reputation, your size and your scale. But we're now seeing exponential organisations come from, nowhere to being multi-billion-dollar companies in a really quick period of time.
Oh, the speed at which they've become massive. I mean, if you take Tesla, for example, and I know Tesla can be a controversial example, but from 2012 to 2012, I mean, that's amazing growth. They'll pump out 1 million cars in the coming 12 months from a stand-up start of 10 years ago. I think what you're describing is right. I think there is the pace of change, as I mentioned earlier, is increasing. And with that pace of change comes how do people keep up? And I think the shift from an agrarian to a more urban kind of society back in the late 1800s, early 1900s was dislocating. And there was a whole heap of social disruption around that. I think there's probably more of that to come as people do grapple with these new technologies, because the speed at which you can implement them is so fast. And I think what used to take a long time to see the effects of. Now with technologies, you can literally switch it on and it's there.
Yeah.
And so I think that's going to take a lot of getting used to. I think there is an element of there will be new jobs. There is no two ways about it. And if you kind of take the job of drone wrangler, who'd have thought that was a job many years ago? Where now there are people who fly drones for a living, and they they monitor pipelines, or they kind of we use them to take photos for real estate. Like, there's a whole heap of use cases, many of which we haven't even thought of yet.
Yeah.
So
I heard a great story about during COVID, pilots and the airline sector was obviously one of the major industries impacted, but pilots were reskilling to fly drones for doing a whole range of these new jobs, looking at all sorts of different applications around drones. So
I think that's yet to play out. And I think the other force, as well as technology, obviously, is climate change.
Yeah.
And I think that will put a lot of pressure on existing industries. And if you think of say fossil fuel industries, which can be they're obviously very capital intensive, but they employ a lot of people, from kind of engineers and every technology, engineers, miners, business people, technology, surveyors, truck drivers, all of that whole gamut of employment opportunities. That will start to shift, and you've heard criticism. Well, I've heard criticism of, not all those people can shift into the solar generation industry, or a job might come up, and installing the solar power farm. Once that's done, maybe the job is mowing the lawn underneath the solar panels. That does not equate to a top engineer job that was in a mine, for example. So I think these are some of the dislocations that are going to take place, and no one yet knows with certainty how that will play out.
I think that's been one of the biggest issues underlying our skills shortages. And I think it's an important area to look at, because often we think of these new technologies as taking away jobs, but we need more conversation around the jobs that they're going to create. Just in technology alone, I think Access Economics has modelled that through to 2025 here in Australia, we'll have a 156,000 job shortfall in just the area of technology alone, a drag on the economy in the order of 10 billion. Then when you add cyber to it and all of these other new and emerging industries. So I think we've got to get the whole reskilling aspect right. I think it's in Australia's national interest in many respects to make sure that we're at the forefront of adapting our workforces and reskilling our workforces for a lot of these very advanced and new industries.
I couldn't agree more, and I think what it does is, I think the coming technological change and industry change and the impacts of climate change, all those types of things, they shine a light on two things in my mind. One is organisations, their ability to adapt, and what are the formal and informal things they need to do to transform and remain relevant to their customers and markets, and what's behind all of that in terms of their business model, how they re-engineer that, how they evolve that to remain relevant. And of course, associated with that then is, for the individuals in those companies, how do you maintain your personal and professional relevance to the workforce? And I think that is what is going to challenge some people, and it depends on how we frame it. We can frame it as a threat, or we can frame it as an opportunity. And I know that can itself be a bit trite, but if we frame it as an opportunity, then what is it that the individual needs to do to remain relevant? And it's not this kind of, I got a job and then I never really had to do any other learning, or I never did any more kind of on-the-job training, or I never pushed into things that kind of made me a bit uncomfortable and kind of challenged, my capacity to do things and really, made me move. And what's the role of education institutions? So what's the role of universities? This kind of, do we do a 3-year degree full-time? Do we do degrees over a longer period? What does the secondary and tertiary education system need to look like in that new world? what's the company expectation in that new world? Is the company kind of got to increase its budgets for training and development of staff, and what role do they play in keeping their people relevant and kind of engaged and all those types of things? So I think there's a lot in this yet to play out, and I think the better companies will start to figure out that the role of they can play in learning, development, lifetime learning, kind of giving people the right incentives to learn, to increase their skills. I think they will figure that out, and they will be the places where people want to work.
Absolutely. Now, Adam, you mentioned a key word there, adaptation. So my life word, as you know, is juvenescence.
Yes.
So what advice would you give professionals and executives out there when they think about the decade ahead, the importance of adapting to a world in accelerated change? What's your advice?
So I'm always wary of giving advice to senior executives, but when I look at the world and how it's changing, I guess the key thing, and I quite like the word juvenescence because it is a great word. I think the key thing for me is how do you retain some curiosity and what I would call shoshin, which is a beginner's mind.
Yes.
Kind of word from Buddhist philosophy, which is just as you approach a task, it's very easy for us as we get older, as we become more successful. It's very easy for us to come at things as though we know the answer, and to not be curious for long enough.
Yes.
So I think the number one advice that I would give myself would be to try and remain curious and have a certain amount of intellectual humility that you just don't know all the answers, and some of the patterns, and this is, I think, this is difficult for executives in many industries, especially if you've grown up in that industry. You self-identify as an expert, and you understand deeply the way that industry works. So it becomes very difficult for you to rethink how that industry might in fact need to work, because you've grown up in one thing. Very hard to then make the mental leap to, industry could be completely different. So I think that I'd characterise about intellectual curiosity, a little bit of humility, and just asking why. And Konrad Adenauer, a former German chancellor, put it pretty well. He said, "Reserve the right to get smarter."
Fantastic. That's amazing. Adam Bennett, it's been wonderful getting your insights, and thank you so much for being a transformational leader in Australian business. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.